Okay, good. I just was welcoming everyone, including our panelists, our distinguished scholar editors, Mark Clague, co-editor-in-chief of Music in the United States of America, known as MUSA, editor-in-chief of the Gershwin Critical Edition. Then two members of the editorial board of the Kurt Weill edition, Joel Galand, who published the first critical edition of a Broadway musical, The Firebrand of Florence, and is currently finishing the first ever publication of any kind of Lerner and Weill's Love Life. Tim Carter, editor of Johnny Johnson, the first critical edition of a musical ever to win the Claude Poliska Prize from the American Musicological Association. And finally, last but not least, Cliff Eisen, Mozart scholar and editor extraordinaire, but also co-editor with Dominic McHugh of the recently published Letters of Cole Porter. I'm not going to spend much time trying to frame this conversation, but I did want to reminisce just a little bit about the historical context of the beginnings of the idea for having critical editions, or at least scholarly editions of American musical theater pieces. It was exactly 30 years ago when the Board of Trustees of the Kurt Weill Foundation approved my recommendation that we embark upon a critical edition of the works of Kurt Weill. I convened the first meeting of the editorial board in 1993, and we set about trying to imagine a set of editorial principles, guidelines, and procedures that would be adequate to the full range of Weill's legacy. And that took us a number of meetings and a great deal of time trying to draft both the handbook and the preface to the edition. The first edited volume didn't appear for a goodly long time, not until 2000, after beginning it all in 1991. And in retrospect, as I look back on it, I don't think that was serendipitous that we, or coincidental, that it was the decade of the 1990s when this took place. I'd like to share, or maybe just remind everyone of what happened in that decade related to the idea of creating some sort of canon standard repertory of the American musical theater. First of all, Leonard Bernstein died in 1990 in October. Second, 1990 saw the release of the first complete recording in what was intended to be a 6-show Gershwin project by None Such Records. Girl Crazy was the first. It was conducted by John Macheri, and it had been reconstructed by Tommy Krasker. Propelled by the momentum generated by his unearthing of the treasure trove of the lost materials for Broadway musicals in a Secaucus, New Jersey warehouse back in 1982, John McLin was reconstructing and conducting studio recordings for EMI of the complete scores of Showboat, Anything Goes, Brigadoon, Annie Get Your Gun, and Kiss Me Kate. The 3-CD, 3.5-hour Showboat album was, of course, a landmark. The New Yorker magazine called it the show album of the past and a show album for the future. It unites the possibilities of reproduction and reinvestigation. It took only a couple years for that prediction to come true when Hal Prince, based on the discoveries that he found in McLin's album, created a new Showboat. It premiered in Toronto in 1993. It would run on Broadway the next years for 947 performances, making it the longest running Showboat ever. 1994, Encores premiered its first season of classic American musicals, and it, of course, is still going. The success of John Maucheri's Scottish opera version of Candide and Bernstein's own final revised recording of the work opened the gates for productions of American musical theaters at opera houses around the globe. By 2000, even the New York Philharmonic was programming annual semi-stage concert performances of Broadway musicals. Clearly, a standard repertory, a canon of American musical theater had been in the making. But unfortunately, most of that repertoire did not have adequate performance materials, editions, if you will, that would be acceptable to opera conductors and symphony conductors and orchestras. They were not as flexible as pit musicians in reading manuscript parts and so forth. Prior to 1990, I myself had conducted about 24 Golden Age musicals. And I kept requesting every time whether I could have a full score to conduct from. And every time the answer was no, it doesn't exist. So I was forced to rehearse these shows with either something that looked like this, the Annie Get Your Gun, or like this, the Carousel score, piano vocal scores, one of which Carousel was not cued, so I didn't even know what orchestra instruments were supposed to be playing at any given time. And the Annie Get Your Gun one was cued, but measure numbers seldom corresponded with the parts and so forth. So accurate editions of this repertoire were really now essential if there was going to be this new wide range of institutions that were going to program this repertoire. So the project could really no longer be deferred. So I think it's no accident the first semi-critical published full score of a Broadway musical was West Side Story in 1993. 3 Vile shows, Kiss Me Kate, Shuffle Along, and Porgy and Bess have now been published, with Love Life and Follies waiting in the wings. Others have been made already available for rental. And as the lyric goes, we've only just begun. And so now will this panel. I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who is going to tell us a bit about the new critical edition of Porgy.
Thanks so much, Kim. And it's just really an honor for me to be here with this distinguished panel of real pioneers in the world of musical theater scholarship and edition making. And I think it's amazing to be here to honor Kim. And I should just thank him again, which he knows, but maybe not everybody else knows, that when we embarked on the project of the Gershwin Critical Edition, we basically emailed Kim and asked him for all of the policy documents for the Kurt Weill edition, and then stole liberally. Initially because we thought, well, Weill is one of those other sort of composers who, bridges classical and sort of Broadway and popular, very much like Gershwin did. But really, it's because of the quality of the work of the board and all of the editors who were involved in creating that edition, because it really is a kind of an exploratory process of, trial and error, really, of just trying to figure out how a musical would look in a critical edition, which is, of course, a tradition that goes back in sort of Western European classical music scholarship to the pioneering editions of Mozart and Beethoven and Bach. We're talking sort of the 19th century. And so the entire discipline was invented around a different tradition. But I think the fascinating thing about having musicals be presented in scholarly edition is not only do you have a full score for the first time and sort of the ability for a conductor to work from those materials, but you have the insights of research that comes to talk about the materials, but in ways that really are in dialogue with the whole tradition of what critical editing is. And I'm sure we'll get into this in a moment, because I think in some ways the Broadway musical expands our notion of the possibilities of what a critical edition is, and actually sort of critiques the tradition in ways that help us realize just actually how much interpretation, how much flexibility, how much these editions are really more recipes for creative artists than they are the truth, and what might be applied with the notion of a scholarly edition. But when we got together and had a little conversation a month ago or so in advance of this panel, we decided we wanted to really start with some music. And because we've done a couple performances recently of the materials from the Porgy and Bess edition, we thought that'd be a great place to start. And the recordings I have to share with you, just it's sort of an edited video with 4 vignettes. And this is from a test performance we did here at the University of Michigan when we were working on the edition of Porgy and Bess. And the real credit for this edition goes to Wayne Shirley, longtime editor and scholar at the Library of Congress, for whom this is a labor of love. I mean, I think Wayne tells the story of the first day he was working at the Library of Congress, and he made a pilgrimage down into the vault to see George's handwritten score for Porgy and Bess. And so it was a lifetime pursuit in many ways to do this. And he spent 4 or 5 years doing the initial draft of this edition in the early 2000s. And the inspiration really for the Gershwin Critical Edition, the reason the family approached the University of Michigan to start this project was to help Wayne's edition see the light of day. Because we really sort of needed a translator from the academic world to help bring this work to publication. The other person who gets a huge amount of credit is my sort of right hand, Andrew Kohler, who's the managing editor of the Gershwin edition. And he really cut his teeth in the project on this and knows every measure and every note almost as well as Wayne. But the example you'll see is done here in Hill Auditorium in Ann Arbor, and it's sort of part of our editorial method to have students at the university try out these editions and sort of help us realize things that are confusing, problems, sort of make the mistakes audible, if you will. It's an archival production, so it's just a single camera shot over the stage, not publicly released. So you're here for a little something special because not everybody gets to look at this. The first vignette is the Jazzboro Brown music, which is sort of this jazz honky-tonk piano, which is at the very, very beginning of the opera, almost never heard today. And I think it's significant for the piece because it's the first thing that sort of introduces the African-American sound world to the listener. And in all but, the Glyndebourne production that I know of that's on video, you never hear this music. So one of the things a critical edition does is it sort of collects all of the scraps of score that have been left out or cut from a lot of different editions. Another piece, the second vignette in this video, is the Buzzard Song, which is sung by Porgy. And it's really, it's a real sort of heroic effort for the Porgy character, the singer, to realize this, because the Buzzard Song and Bess You As My Woman all happen almost in a row, right back to back in the original ordering. But this is an important song. It's triumphant and heroic, sort of shows Porgy's strength, but also invokes this whole theme of the sort of contrast of native folk religion versus Christianity, which, sort of the Mariah and the Serena characters are playing off of throughout the opera or theater piece. And then probably what I think is the most significant, although very short, recovery of the critical edition is a little snippet of dialogue for the character of Bess. Is the third vignette. And this is where she's just about to go out to the picnic in Kittiwah Island. Of course, that's where she encounters Crown, and it's a pivotal moment in the show. But this is right before Porgy sings Bess You As My Woman now, and sort of their love blossoms and it's sort of recognized. But the recovered bit of dialogue is something that Wayne found in a prompt book from the original production. And it's a moment where Bess herself says, Porgy, if you're not going to the picnic on the island, then I'm not going. I'm going to stay with you. And it's sort of that moment where she actually acknowledges her affection and her love for Porgy. And that's what leads to this eruption of passion from Porgy. The way the opera is typically done, it seems to be this kind of masculine, patriarchal claiming of Bess by the male character Porgy. In the original opera, it's actually a dialogue. It's Bess sort of expressing her affection for Porgy, and then Porgy being inspired to profess his love for her. So it totally changes the dynamic of the characters for just this little bit of dialogue that was previously lost to the score, but for Wayne's research. And then the very final aspect of this particular vignette, which is just a minute and a half, 2 minutes long, is some recovered music from the onstage band. So in the original production of Porgy, and actually for the first decade or so, there were actually African-American youth who would be part of orphans bands in New York. They would be recruited to be in the show, and they would, parade around on the stage playing their instruments. And so there was a kind of dialogue between the pit orchestra, the traditional orchestra, and then the onstage band. This score, the actual music for the onstage parts, was in a separate document from the written score that the conductor had. So there was, and in the current version of it, it's just a few added pieces of manuscript that are literally just stuffed into the back of the score. So when the piano vocal score was published, this music did not was not aware to Surmay, so was not included in this course, and nobody really knew it was there. And there's several significant things. First of all, there are literally notes that you wouldn't hear if not for this part, but there's also this dialogue, a call and response between the stage and the pit that's lost acoustically without the onstage part. At the very end of this, you'll see in the video some instrumentalists who are standing up in the orchestra, because the musicians and the singers are all on stage together in this particular production, but the instrumentalists who stand up are the onstage players. And you'll hear particularly some rising chromatic runs at the very end in the saxophones. And that will have never been heard before, at least not since 1940 or so, but for this edition and Wayne's discovery. So let's play this video and then we'll just let the discussion go from there.
You ain't going, I ain't going.
Mark, what a treat. Thank you so much. Tim, you edited a work that was premiered the year after Porgy. Do you want to go next? You need to unmute, just like me.
I edited Johnny Johnson, which was a collaboration between Kurt Weill and Paul Green, the great North Carolina playwright. And that's one reason why I got involved in the project, because I teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And that had a whole set of problems, somewhat similar to Mark's with Porgy and Bess. And I'm very struck by Mark's introduction there, and also the music, which is fabulous. I mean, the edition is truly wonderful, because I think that the purpose of these critical editions is certainly to make materials available to performers that have not hitherto been available. The new Porgy and Bess edition does that. My Johnny Johnson edition does that. The Firebrand of Florence edition has done that. The Love Life edition will do that. But I also think that there's a question about whether the purpose of these editions is to keep performers honest. And I'm not always sure they are. For example, the Porgy and Bess. I mean, Mark was talking about the importance of the Jasbro Brown opening and also the heroic, important buzzard song for Porgy and what that tells us about the characterization of Porgy. Okay, so we go to the Metropolitan Opera. They're doing Porgy and Bess, and what do they cut? They cut the Jasbro Brown opening. Okay, there's a sanction for that. And they cut the buzzard song. And the point is, they don't tell us what they're cutting. they don't tell us what they're missing. So here is the Met saying, we're doing Porgy and Bess, a fabulous production, a wonderful production with truly great singers, claiming all sorts of things about doing the Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, but they're not. And yet they have these materials available to them. So I'm all in favor of giving performers options. All performers have to make choices. All productions have to make choices. But to what extent should we also be trying in some way to keep these companies honest in terms of what they're doing and what they're presenting? And Mark, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No, that's really interesting. Of course, I mean, well, one of the things when we did the performance here in Ann Arbor of the complete music, I mean, it was a revelation to me. I mean, and there was many more things I would have liked to share with you, but the original Porgy and Bess is in 3 acts. There's 2 intermissions, and the third act is sort of the whole post-hurricane aspect of the show. And it really starts with this sort of beautiful sunrise, and there's this way in which nature goes on, and there's literally 10 minutes of music, which I had never heard before in my life, which I think is some of the most beautiful music in the show. But the evening lasted 4 hours, you know, I mean, so it's really a practical challenge of what you do. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things about the editions, I mean, my edition of American in Paris, I think only once have I attended, you know, a performance, I've been to about a dozen, where I said, oh, they did what I wanted. Every other one, you know, creative artists, composers, they do their thing and break the rules and change stuff. And I think what critical editions do is it gives them, you know, a kind of not only the materials, but a little bit about the insights into the original state of those materials, the kinds of, you know, highlight some decisions. But even the critical edition is, you know, for those of us who are editors, is our interpretation of the materials. So there's always a level. And I think what critical editions do is they try to confess that interpretation. You know, the Metropolitan's performance didn't even mention it was a critical edition that they were using in the program book. So, you know, it's I don't know, in many ways, I guess it just didn't surprise me. So I wasn't upset about it. I do think that the music sparkled in a way maybe it hadn't before because of all the work we had done and cleaning stuff up and sort of making it available and really allowing, letting musicians know that they could trust what was on the page. But it is an interesting experience as an editor, but I think that's one of the things it reveals is just how many decisions are being made, contemporary decisions are being made in any performance. And so the notion that there is one true way to do it, I think we would think a critical edition might make that case, but in fact, it sort of reveals the fiction of that, even that goal.
I had the same problem with Johnny Johnson. I produced a kind of maximal version of Johnny Johnson, which we know was performed at the time, but Johnny Johnson suffered all sorts of cuts in the process and continued to do so even after Kurt Weill's death. And so my maximal version was basically there to give people choices to go this way or that way and so on. But one company that was had produced Johnny Johnson before my edition then accused me of being a script doctor. And that was not a compliment in any way, shape or form. And I tried to persuade them that I'm not a script doctor. I'm not trying to sort out just the script for production purposes. I'm just trying to put the materials out there so that companies can make informed choices about what they are doing. Anyway, that's one of my contributions.
Cliff, when we met before virtually, you had some pretty forceful ideas about the question of trying to inscribe in critical editions what might be thought of as an old-fashioned view of authorial authenticity and authority. You want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, sure. You know, picking up on what Mark and Tim said, I agree 100% with what's been said so far, and I might put it as what a critical edition does is raise the possibility to ask questions about how to perform it, how to perform a piece. It offers options, right? You know, Tim was just saying this. Critical editions don't, I mean, I'm talking mostly about my experience with Mozart, but critical editions do not set a fixed text, partly because we don't actually know what the text means. So to say that there's a fixed text, most people take that in the I think to mean that there's only one way to do things. Whereas my experience has been that certainly with Mozart, doing a critical edition, the point is to raise the possibility that questions can be asked of the score, how to do it, what it means, whether it's analytical or performative or whatever. And that's the real value, because certainly, you know, for 18th century music and 19th century music, what critical editions do is to open those questions, whereas other editions have closed off the possibility to ask those questions. I mean, you know, you're not given a critical report, you're not given all the performance history of the work. So for me, the real value is that it opens up all of the interpretive possibilities, whether it's to include or not include what this particular notation means. And critical editions allow us to forge individual interpretations, which I think is the point of any performance, because one wants to give his interpretation. You don't want to just do what everyone else did. So at heart, I think that that's the issue about critical editions and the value of critical editions. I don't know if we want to discuss any of the nitty-gritty, but certainly one of the things that's behind both, I think, what Mark and Tim is saying is the fact that what these editions represent, okay, or what any source represents, is a moment in the performance history, right? I mean, so the editor's task is going to be to, you know, try to determine, and it's not always possible, exactly what moment that is, right? But this is how you can also reconstruct a performing tradition, whether it includes authorial intervention or sanction or not. And by viewing a source as representing a moment in the performance history allows us to more accurately identify how a production may have changed over a period of time, to speculate why changes were made. I mean, take a case like something I know, something like Don Giovanni, right? So many productions include both of Ottavio's arias. And yes, you can do it that way, and it makes it a lot longer. That's not the way it was, but you need to have the option of knowing that there was a Vienna version and a Prague version, right? In order to make a decision as to what you, the performer, thinks is best. It would be the same with Elvira's Mitradi and other scenes. So I think there is actually, and I had the impression when we talked before, that we were trying to almost draw a distinction between editing 18th century music and 19th century music and editing Broadway musicals. And I'm not 100% sure that there is that kind of fundamental distinction, so much as it's incredibly more difficult to deal with a Broadway show because there are so many more sources. And in some ways, because of, can I say, standardization of how paper is manufactured, right, which is a big a factor in how you identify what moment in the history of a performance you're dealing with. It's just much, much more complicated. But I don't think the fundamental idea of editing a Mozart opera and editing a Broadway show is essentially different, because the purpose in the end, as I say, would be the same, which is to open up the possibility for the performer to create an interpretation.
Thank you. Joel, one of the reasons that critical editions take so long and so much effort and so much money to actually come to fruition is precisely what Cliff just put his finger on, and that is that the richness on the one hand of the sources, but then also the problem of because they weren't created together in the same room in many cases, and they aren't lined up chronologically, very hard to determine a moment. And I was wondering if you'd like to talk about that from your experience with either Firebrand or Love Life. Love Life might be even more complex because it had a very, what shall we say, interesting genesis.
Well, I was also going to follow up on something Cliff said, but I'll start with what you just asked. When I did Firebrand, because it was my first experience with editing, I thought it was a difficult job. In retrospect, it seems easy because it's an operetta, and in fact, it changed very little over the course of the production. There were a couple of minor cuts made after Boston. There were some rewrites to the script, but it was a relatively closed form. On the other hand, Love Life is a perfect example of what people would call an open form, a modular construction, and you can reconstruct at least 6 different performing versions, from the late rehearsal period through the New Haven tryouts, the Boston tryouts, 3 weeks in Boston, and the original New York production. And there's a massive materials there to sift through, over some 1,000 pages of full score, because poor Weill orchestrated everything. And well, there are a couple of things that his assistant Irving Schlein orchestrated, but pretty much it was all Weill, and he even retouched Schlein's orchestrations. So there was 300 pages or so of full score that ended up not being used. So more unused material. Well, it was used, but eventually cut or replaced. So there, I do like Tim did for Johnny Johnson, the maximal version. And every production has been slightly different. There's only one that was based on the critical edition so far. Well, Encore's never quite took place, but so discounting that, it was Freiburg, and then I think Bern did the same production. And they cut quite a few things, but mostly things that had been cut in Boston. But what they did didn't match quite any of the half-dozen documented stages. They did something slightly different, but they of course followed the edition delightfully and faithfully. So at least you got to hear Weill's orchestrations and some snippets that had not been heard in say, the Opera North production. The final ending to Part 1, which beautifully counterpoints Sam's "I'm Your Man" with the love duet from the first scene, "Here I'll Stay." It's quite a stirring moment, but it had never quite been done correctly, at least in my opinion. As far as lining up sources that come from different times, yes, sometimes you get lucky. Couldn't quite figure out how the reprise of My Kind of Night in Part 1 was supposed to go. There were dialogue cues that didn't correspond to the script I had. Well, actually, I found them in Elia Kazan's script, which dates from just just before the tryouts. So that I was able to reconstruct the maximal version of that number. It was easy to construct the shorter version, which was the final version done in New York, but the longer version, which was the one that was in Weill's full score, I couldn't figure out what dialogue was supposed to go along with that. So, but then.
Okay, Joel, sorry to interrupt. We have 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes left, so I'd like to have everyone have a chance to have a minute to say something that they're just burning to say about edition making of musicals. So Joel, you said you had a follow-up to Cliff, or you want to start with that? Is that something you want to?
I just wanted to follow up with the idea of giving performers choices. And we do that all the time in the Weill edition. For example, if some orchestral parts were eliminated, perhaps to accommodate a particular singer, we will often put those parts back in cue size notation. So the performer has a choice, can see, okay, the singer is having a little difficulty projecting. We can see what they did in 1948. So that's just an example. That's something I love about edition making. we editors have to make the decisions, but at the same time, we can offer, within certain parameters, choices. And we have, for the critical apparatus, we have on-page footnotes in case something is really important and we want the performer, the conductor, to actually go and look at the critical report here. So, I think what's most fun is when the critical edition gets into production, as it were, and you get to actually work with the performers.
Great, let's go in reverse order. Cliff? Oh, you need to unmute. Unmute, please. Unmute.
Okay.
There.
Yeah. Just the one thought. I'm trying to put things in a nutshell, and in a way, it's what's been traditionally the case, which I think we're all striving here to avoid, is that there is a difference between an authentic text and an authentic performance. Now, having an authentic text opens the possibilities for thinking about things. The problem has been that there's been an expectation that an authentic text and an authentic performance are the same thing, right? But no performance is, in a way, authentic in the sense that it's always subject to interpretation, which may involve how you read any particular moment in the notation or how you structure the whole, in the case of Don Giovanni, as I was saying. And that's why critical editions are so important and so interesting, is that they, as I said, allow the performer, the interpreter, to interpret. And having that authentic text invites interrogation. It produces effective performances. And there is actually unless you're a real authenticist and you want to do everything exactly the way it was, there's really no one-to-one correspondence between authentic texts and authentic performances. All performances are authentic in a sense, but not all texts. And that's why critical editions are important.
Great. Tim?
I was struck by Kim Kowalke's introduction, where you were talking quite eloquently about the 1990s and how crucial the 1990s were for beginning to think about how to recover these classic musicals. Because, of course, within musicological spheres, the 1990s was going in a completely, utterly different direction. The so-called new musicology was not wanting to get into editions in any way, shape, or form, which probably explains why we have 5 faces of a very particular kind in this panel. It takes time to make an edition. Kim mentioned, the years that it took for the first Court Mahon edition to come out. Johnny Johnson, it was 8 years of my life. Very happy years in my life, but it was 8 years of my life. And also to make editions, you need the support of the Gershwin Foundation on the one hand, or the Lerner and Lowe Foundation on the other, or the Court Mahon Foundation with its editorial staff behind to provide the materials with which the editor can work. It saddens me that editions do not have as high a priority as they should do in current musicological circles, because really this is where musicology potentially comes most into contact with the real world of performance. And yet sometimes, we old people, and I count myself in that category, are fighting a kind of losing battle in terms of what we think might really matter in terms of what we're doing.
Great. And Mark, I think we've 1 minute they'll give us yet.
I'll be fast. Well, I love what Tim said, in part because it's the magic as a scholar of working with the music that I think is so exciting about editions and that make it really rewarding. But if I had to say the one thing, that the real challenge of musicals and then the real value of these editions is actually just the process of collecting the source material. This source material is so hard to find and takes so many years to dig up. It's in archives and sort of traditional academic spaces, but it's also in commercial spaces and commercial libraries and rental agencies and things like that. And so I think the value of recovering these materials that often weren't seen maybe until the 90s as really having historical value, right, as something that we'd want to remember. That's really the act of finding and valuing these materials is maybe the most important part, I think, of these editions to helping the future of the tradition.
Thank you all. Chris?
Yes, thanks to the panel for this engaging discussion, and thanks, Kim, for facilitating. We appreciate it.